Welcome to the Bend Don't Break podcast. I am Aaron Schweitzer, your host, along with the infinitely curious reporter Laurel Bronze. This podcast is powered by the Source Weekly, Bend's locally owned newspaper. This podcast is also generously supported by Worthy Brewing, putting education first, utilizing green technologies, and experimenting daily to brew the best damn beer in the Pacific Northwest while treading as lightly on the earth as possible, living out their mantra, earth first, beer second. Our guest today is Jeff Eager. He is a business attorney and former mayor of Bend, has lived in Bend for 16 years, also married, father of 2 boys, 4 and 5. He is also the publisher of the Bend Business Roundup newsletter, of which I am a subscriber and a fan. And thank you for being with us today, Jeff.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Laurel.
Hey, I wanted to just chat a little bit about your newsletter. It was what piqued my interest about having you on our podcast. And how did you get the idea to start writing that? What was the motivation?
The motivation was kind of twofold. One is I was kind of casting about for a way to, I guess, frankly, market my law firm. And then also I enjoy writing quite a bit. And so I landed on this as something to do. And as a subscriber, Aaron, you know, it's not like I try to sell stuff on there, but it's just a way for me to write about what I am thinking about and what I think about things. I've been at it for a few years now and enjoy doing it quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a fun read for those people who haven't subscribed to it. I'm a fan of how you never know what's coming. I enjoyed the poem as well as the defense of Thomas Jefferson. I thought it was well thought out, and it's good. Well, it is called the Bend Business Roundup. So I was curious if you had or wanted to share some of your thoughts and perceptions about how local businesses might be faring right now, or what you're hearing.
It's kind of a weird situation right now. I feel like the economy locally is probably doing a lot worse than what it feels like right now. And I think that's papered over to a degree by the federal funding that's come in for small businesses and also kind of the boost in unemployment insurance for those people who have been able to obtain their unemployment insurance. And I think that, but when you look at, I think Deschutes County has about 16% unemployment. That's really high. I mean, I remember when I was on the city council back during the Great Recession, and we had, I think, 10 or 12% unemployment, and that felt really, really bad, and it was really bad. 16% doesn't so far feel as bad across the region, I don't think, but I think part of that is because of the stimulus that's come through. I see from my business clients, it really slowed down in March and April, but then beginning in May and certainly now I guess it's July, May and June, it picked up quite a bit and has been busy. I think people are doing deals again. People are kind of trying to operate their business. And I think people have come to the realization that the end is not here economically, at least not yet. And they're kind of just doing their thing. But as the stimulus wears off, I wonder how that's going to look for us locally.
Yeah, I mean, having been the mayor during the recession, what's your feelings about what can city government do during these times, and do you have any feelings about how the current city council is dealing with this?
The honest answer is there's not a lot that the city can do. I think that there are some things they can do in terms of introducing some flexibility, which the city has done to a degree with kind of allowing restaurants downtown to have seating in streets or sidewalks or parking areas. And so there are a few things like that, but when you're talking about kind of a pandemic caused major slowdown to the national and really international economies, there's only so much that a city like Bend can do. I think that the council, so far, they've done, as far as I can see, reasonably well with providing flexibility where they can. they've been, as far as I can see, pretty responsive when people have come to them with ideas about some things that could be relaxed or changed to allow businesses to make it through this time. So I think they're doing a fine job.
As we move up the political food chain, any thoughts about how the governor's doing? I mean, personally, I feel like she's, as a politician, you're going to catch it from both sides. What would you say? How would you say she's doing?
I think that she suffered somewhat from a lack of clarity in communications on this stuff to a degree. Kind of early on, there was the open, I guess, dispute with Ted Wheeler about whether they were going to shut down the economy or not, and Portland was going to go on its own until the state joined up. I think that that's hampered things to a degree. I will say that in comparison to places like, say, California, I think she's been relatively moderate in her response. I think that one thing that has introduced some more confusion, though, is the fact that, and I think this is hampering her ability to really enforce kind of the masking laws in the other kind of shutdown type laws, is that she really openly embraced the protests throughout the state, and especially in Portland, which I think those were, at least to the degree they were nonviolent and weren't destructive, those were good things too. But they were clearly in violation of her order, and she supported them outright. And now she's asking Oregonians to behave in a manner that is consistent with her rules when she has very publicly embraced people who have flouted those rules. So I think that puts her in a difficult position, and I think it makes it more difficult for the state to enforce its kind of pandemic-related rules going forward.
Yeah, you had some comments in your blog too about the discrepancy between the way she reacted to those protests and the way she reacted to the protests about opening the economy.
I mean, they were very different. They were, it wasn't just her. I would say a good portion of the media reacted very differently to those two types of protests, and they're, I mean, it just, she prefers the Black Lives Matter protests to the reopen the economy protests, which is her right to have that preference. But I think that's pretty visible to people in the community that she thinks that one is fine even in violation of pandemic rules, whereas the other is not fine, even though it's in violation of the pandemic rules.
Do you, thinking a little broader, do you have any concerns or any thoughts about the role of government as we start moving through something like a pandemic? I mean, obviously for good or bad, they've had to take on certain responsibilities which probably never have taken on prior to this, maybe going back till 1918 or something. But thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's, I think that there has been, I think we in the United States have been fortunate in the sense that for the last, a couple decades anyway, we've had a reasonably decent economy with the exception of the Great Recession. And we haven't had any major crises, probably since 9/11, I guess, would be the last kind of major crisis that government had to respond to. And so I think as a result, we haven't emphasized competence in our elected officials. And this isn't to single out any particular elected official as incompetent, but in these kinds of situations, we require a different, or hopefully we require a different skill set than people who are adept at social media or who are adept at inflaming the other side or who are kind of slick that way. We want people who actually know how to govern and can govern in an effective and clear way. And that's not something that, I don't think that's been the top criterion, or maybe even one of the top 5 criterion in the way that the electorate has chosen its elected officials lately.
Do you think that, I mean, I have my own feelings about what's exacerbating that, and social media for me certainly rises to the top. Do you share those concerns that, in this day and age, it's very hard to govern? And I think even from the time when you were probably elected mayor, I mean, we can get into national or local level politics, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to ferret out competency from the kind of, I call them monkeys with machine guns
Right,
on
right.
Twitter. So
Yeah, I think social media definitely plays into it. I think that social media really is just a, provides a forum for human nature to be displayed on a wider basis and on a wider scale than what it had previously. Because anyone, I started an email newsletter that people read. Anyone can start an email newsletter that people can read. Whereas before, that wasn't something, before the internet was prominent, that wasn't something you could do. You needed to have publishing resources and whatnot. And I think that having that ability to have people speak their mind at any time has a lot of good things to it, but it also has a way of inflaming things and kind of dividing people into their camps, and it does make governing more difficult. I think another thing that's honestly made governing much more difficult is the fact that local media has struggled, and that the amount of news, especially pertaining to local stuff, isn't as prevalent as it used to be, even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Because there's just not the coverage resources. The Source does a good job of covering local stuff. The Bulletin is much reduced from where it used to be, and there just aren't those resources so that people in the community can get information about what's going on that's from a relatively trusted or reliable source, even though everyone knows these sources also have their points of view oftentimes. So I think that makes it harder because you're not getting those kind of mediating institutions in between who's governing and who's consuming information about who's governing. And that makes for kind of a messy situation.
do you feel like, I mean, in addition to the shrinking resources, which thank you for bringing up, by the way, the how much of it is that the readership or the community itself, do they value it as much, or how do you think that local coverage of city council issues, well, it scales pretty high, so does food cart reviews, and so does the latest squabble on social media. So can you pivot people, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it's just a question of is it a supply problem or a demand problem in terms of local news, or both? And it's probably some of both. And I think they feed into each other in the sense that it's much easier for me if I wanted to find out what was going on in Washington, D.C. right now, in terms of whatever kind of, like the PPP extension that was just passed either today or yesterday. That got a lot of coverage because it's national, and because that business model of covering that kind of news scales, because you still only need one reporter covering it for a particular news agency, but then you have 5 million people reading it instead of one reporter covering some Bend City Council meeting where you maybe have 5,000 people reading it. Right. So I think that the demand is governed in part by what people are exposed to. You can sit at home all day and watch Fox News or MSNBC or CNN and just be deluged with national stuff. There is no similar immersion, probably fortunately, in local or even state government. It's just not there. Right. So I think that the national stuff has been sensationalized to the point that it's almost like watching a soap opera. And that appeals to a certain group of people that maybe wouldn't find a story about Ben's sewer expansion project similarly interesting. But I do think it's partially a matter of just what's available to people. I think there is a demand to amongst those people who who demanded it back when the journalism business model worked better. You know, people were selling papers, people were selling ads back then. It's just, I think there's a different ad delivery market now than what there was.
Yeah, and also there's just an overabundance of that other kind of news. I mean,
Yep.
You've got people glued to the sets watching 24-hour cable news, and then you're asking them to pick up a newspaper or tune into a podcast. It's a pretty small, you're trying to wedge into a pretty roaring river there. So I tend to think that's also part of the issue. Laurel, would you like to jump in with some questions as well?
Sure. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about the corporate activity tax.
Mm-hmm.
I know you wrote an editorial in May of 2019 for the Bulletin, and I was wondering if you could just explain to our listeners what it is and what your viewpoint is on that.
Yeah, so the corporate activity tax is a tax that the state of Oregon instituted that is basically a tax on economic activity or on sales in the state of Oregon, and whereby any business that sells anything, goods or services within the state of Oregon, is taxed on the amount of sales once you get above, I believe, $1 million in sales in Oregon, regardless of whether there's a profit or not that the business enjoys as a result of that sale activity. And so this is the first time this kind of thing has been tried in Oregon, and I believe it's pretty unique nationwide. And unfortunately, the implementation of it has occurred at a time when a lot of businesses are really having a rough time right now. And so to the degree businesses, you know, if we were just with our kind of business income tax and personal income tax stuff, which is still in place, of course, then if a business doesn't have a profit because there's a pandemic and they've had to close down for part of the quarter, their tax bill would go down concurrently because they're not making a profit. Now, with the corporate activities tax, they're still going to pay a tax as long as they have sales above $1 million in any given calendar year. So it's almost like a worst case scenario type of tax for this particular situation, which of course, when they passed it, no one knew that this was going to happen. But yeah, that's the cat tax.
And what do you not like about it?
Well, I think in general, what I don't like about it is that the way the tax is implemented as being a tax on sales and not on income or on profit has a really nasty effect on certain types of businesses in particular. For example, I think in that op-ed you're referring to, I talked about, you know, someone's building a home in Bend. And, you know, if I'm Joe Blow home builder and I build $1 million house, which there are plenty of $1 million houses in Bend now, unfortunately, that you're going to be impacted by that tax, even though the vast bulk of that $1 million is maybe going to go to subcontractors and whatnot. And it's not like you're realizing a giant profit necessarily on the $1 million house. And that can really have an impact on the availability of affordable housing. Now, no one would call $1 million house affordable housing, but if you build, you know, $300,000 houses, then you run into the same situation. So, and we need people building more houses here in order to accommodate the people that are moving here and apparently still moving here, even during the pandemic, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, as far as I've seen, the real estate prices have not dropped as commensurate with the economy, and that is blowing my mind, to be honest. But
yep.
Laurel?
You've done some research on the Bend Police Union contract.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you found out and what, if any, changes you would recommend?
Yeah, so I looked into that when kind of post George Floyd, there was a lot of, and still is a lot of scrutiny into how a jurisdiction would discipline a police officer who is misbehaving. Apparently the officer who killed Mr. Floyd had 16 or 17 infractions previously, and he was obviously still on the job. And I knew from my time on the city council that these contracts are heavily weighted toward union members. And so I went back and I found the contract, and I looked through it as an example, and it's, as far as I know, typical of police contracts. And I think we're fortunate here in Bend that we've got a pretty proactive police force that is, its leadership is certainly committed to making sure things are done fairly and well.
Sure.
But it's the contract shows how this can be a problem if you don't have that kind of leadership and a culture that ensures that people are treated properly. And it's, the contract, basically it makes it nearly impossible to discipline someone who, in any real way, certainly to terminate someone who has done things that are improper in the line of duty. And that's a problem. And frankly, it's a problem that affects all public employee union contracts, not just police. But police are a little different in the sense that they have guns, and they are authorized by the community to use force to, in theory, promote public safety. And therefore there's more potential for harm to be done to private individuals. Whereas, teachers also can't be easily disciplined, but usually they're not killing people. So I think it's a concern for police, and I think it's a concern for other public sector unions. What can be done about it is, I think that there should be at least a weakening of those provisions in the contracts that allow or force disciplinary measures to go up to an arbitrator who can easily overturn, and frequently does overturn, disciplinary measures that are undertaken by the local jurisdiction when someone does something wrong. In effect, what that does is it makes local jurisdictions reluctant to issue discipline to begin with, because they know that there is likely to be an appeal, and if there is an appeal, the arbitrator is likely to rule with the union member who's in question.
Do you remember any issues while you were on city council in terms of oversight of the department? Like, was it just kind of a hands-off situation, or you guys?
No, it was, we didn't when I was on council, we didn't deal with a lot of police issues. It was more, we dealt with police issues in the sense that we were trying to not lay off police officers because the revenues were going down so dramatically. And I can't think of an instance where there was any kind of, certainly any police brutality type of situation that at least came to the council. So to be honest with you, it was not an area where the council exercised a tremendous amount of oversight. Now, when these contracts come up, and they did while I was on council, basically your options are that same arbitration system applies if you get into a dispute with your union about renegotiating a contract. And if it goes up to the arbitrator, what the labor lawyers say is that you're very likely to lose as a city. So there's a lot of power held by these unions to have these contracts look a certain way, and that's why they look the way that they do. So yeah.
I mean, I should throw in also that they also make it incredibly difficult for journalists to get information on discipline.
Yes.
We've been working on trying to get information about some of the police chief, past records on that stuff, and the process is tedious.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, personnel records, it makes it very difficult to get personnel records, and in large measure, the reason why that is what's in those contracts. There is also there are aspects of Oregon law that protect just everyone's personnel records to a degree. But yeah, it definitely stands in the way of a lot of public records stuff.
Jeff, we're reaching the end of our time here. Is there some subject or something you'd like to speak about that we haven't touched on?
No, well, no, I just wrote something the other day that's kind of, you might be interested in. And so the issue of the Oregon State and U of O saying we're not going to call the Civil War anymore.
Yeah.
And so when I saw that, I went to U of O for law school, and I don't really care what they call the game. But what the OSU president said in relation to the decision was that they didn't want to have a game that wasn't named, they're saying it wasn't named after the Civil War, but they didn't want any kind of correlation to a war that he said was fought to perpetuate slavery. And that kind of stuck in my craw a little bit, because the Confederacy was fighting it to perpetuate slavery, but they lost. And the Civil War actually sped the abolition of slavery significantly. You don't have the Emancipation Proclamation without the Civil War. You don't have the 13th Amendment without the Civil War. You don't have the smashing of the slavery economy in the South without the Civil War. So that's something that I've been a little bit thinking about. So just that.
Yeah, well, I expect that I will see that in the Ben Business Roundup.
You will. You will.
Well, Jeff, again, thank you for taking the time to sit in on the Ben Don't Break podcast, and keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate you taking a thoughtful moment with us.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Laurel.
Thank you.